All right, so the new developments with Iran. Now, this is like my fifth time trying to do this video. So because it is, I want to go through quite a bit of stuff when it comes to the latest with Iran, and it's a little bit cumbersome. So just stick with me, okay? Because I don't want to have to do this video again. I'm tired. Okay, so the latest is that Iran has announced that they're going to be upping their enrichment of uranium, and that is going to be breaching the Iran nuclear deal. And they've said that they are going to enrich as much uranium as they want, but it's probably going to be about 5%. So this is in response to an oil tanker, the Grace 1, being seized by the UK off the coast of Gibraltar, in the Gibraltar Strait, I believe, is where that tanker was. And the UK decided to seize the tanker. Now, Iran kind of looked at that and said, hey, EU, the United States already backed out of this deal, and we said that we were going to keep a deal with you. But, you know, now, since you guys are going to start seizing our tankers, I guess we're not really in a deal so much. So Iran has announced that they're going to be upping their enrichment of uranium. Now, one thing I want to point out is that most of the mainstream media, if not all of them at this point, haven't really given an alternative viewpoint as to why Iran is wanting to increase their uranium enrichment. They lead the viewer to believe that the reason why Iran wants to up their enrichment of uranium is to build a nuclear bomb. Like, this is their way of threatening us. And that is not true. Not necessarily true. That could be why they're doing it. I don't know. I'm not in the Iranian inner circle. But there is an alternative idea. And it is that we are engaging in a war on energy. And Iran is in the middle of this, and they understand very well what this means. And they're trying to combat this energy war. So what do I mean? Well, we've seen the war on energy before. It is a great way if you're wanting to topple a government or squeeze a government or pressure a government. It is a great way to do it. Instead of dropping a bomb, you reduce their ability to get energy. That means that they can't cool their nation, heat their nation. They can't keep their nation powered. They can't keep fuel in the cars, and that means less food will be delivered and less medicines will be delivered. If you can constrain a nation's energy resources, then you're leaving people literally in the dark. You're basically saying, light a candle, guys, because that's your new reality. And until your government does what we want, this is the way you're going to live. And that causes the people to become very desperate because they don't, the hospitals lose power, people can't get their food, on and on and on. You could only imagine if all of a sudden the lights went out. And if you couldn't get gasoline, or if gasoline became outrageously expensive, or you couldn't heat your home, you got a baby, or you're the elderly, or you live in Arizona, you could imagine how bad this would be. And so it makes populations desperate. This is the idea behind it. And then those populations would rise up and pressure their government or even topple their government. Now, it is largely suspected by myself and others that Venezuela recently, when they went through their power blackouts, that was an attack on their electrical grid. We know that the CIA has developed, or maybe it wasn't the CIA, maybe it was the military. No, I think it was the CIA. It might have been another branch of the military, or maybe it was many branches of the military working together on plans on how they could use attacking nations' electrical grid as a means of attacking them. And that was actually developed during the Obama administration. So it just would stand to reason that probably we ended up trying that tactic in Venezuela when we were trying to topple Maduro and put Guaido in, because it's just odd, the timing, right? That all of a sudden Venezuela would go dark for a few days. Well, it puts people in a state of panic. So Syria, now this is all tying in. Syria, they have been sanctioned since 2011 by Europe. And what the sanctions were was that there would be no trading of oil with Syria, which actually harmed Europe quite a bit because they got quite a bit of their oil resources from Syria, and they had to put a stop to that, and it was hurting both sides. So Iran stepped up when those sanctions went in, and Iran started to supply Syria with oil. Now, Iran is an ally to Bashar al-Assad, the same with Russia. They were the nations that were supporting Syria, and so they stepped in after 2011. They've been shipping loads and loads of oil to Syria for a while now. But with the sanctions against Iran by the U.S., Iran couldn't use their typical methods of delivering that oil to Syria. I believe they were using a pipeline, and that pipeline was basically blocked. I'm not 100% certain on that, but I'm pretty sure. getting this information was actually kind of difficult. But I'm pretty sure that that was what was going on, that they were using a pipeline to get the oil to Syria. And then in December, when the United States started sanctioning Iran in order to try to pressure them into a new deal, Iran started using ships to, or maybe they were using a combo before, but they were using ships to go through the Persian Gulf. You know, they would go into the Persian Gulf, they would go around the Arabian Peninsula, and they would end up, they would enter the Red Sea, they would pass through the Suez Canal, and then they would get into a Syrian port. That's about 3,000, a little over 3,000 nautical miles. Okay, that's the way they would take this ship. And they were doing that for since December. They had been still getting oil to Syria. But because of the sanctions on Iran from the U.S., it actually caused a huge energy crisis in Syria. So it was kind of a 1-2 punch for the United States. So it created this crisis in Syria. The people in Damascus are reporting that they're waiting long lines for gasoline. Things have become really expensive. It's become really bad in Syria because they're now being attacked. Their energy essentially is being attacked. Well, Iran, what had happened, why this tanker was seized, was because this particular tanker, the Grace 1, they actually had sent 2 tankers to Syria right around the 4th of July. And the first tanker went the way that I just told you. You know, it went those 3,000 nautical miles to Syria. But when it got there, the pipe that actually takes the underwater pipeline that delivers the crude to a Syrian refinery had exploded. So that one ship was just sitting there in the water waiting. It was stranded. It needed to offload this oil, and it couldn't because the pipeline had exploded. Now, Syria claims that a foreign power meddled with their pipeline and that was that was an attack on Syria. That's what they claim. They ended up fixing that pipeline, and that ship was able to deliver the oil. Well, Iran had also at that same time sent a super tanker of oil. That's the Grace 1. But this super tanker, the problem with the super tanker is that it goes pretty deep in the water. And if it goes too deep, it can't go the way that I just explained. It has to go all the way around Africa. It's got to go 12,000 nautical miles rather than 3,000 nautical miles. It's got to go the long way. And it's because they were unable to, typically a ship would go into this region, and then it would actually offload some of the oil so that it would rise up above 20 meters in the water, and it would use a pipeline for some of it and then ship the rest in. But because of the sanctions, Saudi Arabia wasn't going to allow this oil to go into that pipeline. So this super tanker had to go all the way around Africa, and it ended up going a route that it went through Gibraltar, and it ended up getting seized by the UK. So Iran is saying, give us our ship back. Now they're claiming, they're like, it wasn't going to Syria, because they know you can't prove where it's going. It probably was going to Syria, but they're saying, it wasn't doing anything. It's none of your business where that ship was going. Give us our tanker back. The UK is saying, no, they're not going to give back the tanker. Iran is saying, you better give us back the tanker. And the Syrians are really wanting that tanker to port because they really need that oil. So it's a real problem for Syria, and it's a problem for Iran but it's a bigger problem for Syria, and it's a problem for Iran that this tanker has been taken, because for Iran, this showed that the UK was now hostile towards Iran. And this was the EU, and the EU is supposed to still be friendly with Iran, saying, look, if we just stay in the deal, we'll be okay. And they were supposed to help push back against the U.S. sanctions. And this move by the UK is a signal that Europe is caving to the U.S. and what the U.S. wants. That's a bad sign for Iran. So Iran has decided to up their enrichment of uranium. And they're probably making this announcement for 2 reasons. The first reason is, probably to sort of pressure the countries, the EU and the United States, into doing a deal, into getting the United States back into the nuclear deal and honoring it, and Europe also to continue honoring the nuclear deal. Iran is probably using it as a form of leverage. But in the event that none of that works, Iran is also needing an energy source. And one energy source that Iran has been wanting for a very long time, they have some of it, but they don't have nearly enough for their growing population and for their developing nation, is they want nuclear power. And in order to have nuclear power, you need to enrich uranium at above 3.5%, which is what they're doing. They moved it up a little bit above 3.5%, and now they're probably going to go to 5%, which would be enough to power their bigger nuclear power plants that they had to stop building with, and they weren't allowed to use, or they had to dismantle them or something when the nuclear deal happened. So Iran is looking for a way to be energy independent. And the reason that's important is because, for a lot of these developing nations, now the world has this kind of idea where they say to people, look, we don't want any more nations to have nuclear weapons. That's always the narrative, but you have to read between the lines a little bit, right? Which is why I'm here. I'm here to help you with that. So when they say, look, we don't want any other nation to have nuclear weapons. What this also prevents is these other nations from having nuclear power. Because you need a lot of uranium for nuclear power. Now, it doesn't get enriched nearly to the levels that you would need for a bomb. But if you were going to have your own nuclear power and you're going to be enriching your own uranium, you could probably move towards the levels of the amount of the enriched uranium you would need to make a bomb within a couple of months. Whereas if you're a nation that doesn't have your own capabilities of enriching uranium, you just would never be allowed to have that amount. You wouldn't get your hands on it. Or like with Iran, at the levels that they were enriching uranium, it would take them years in order to build a nuclear bomb. So the problem for what this does to these developing nations is, so when oil was discovered and the United States was we were the nation that just had oil, we had all this amazing oil, and we were using this as leverage to, around the world. So as the world started developing, they needed oil, for cars and energy and all of this. But then what happened over the years was that more oil reserves were discovered in Saudi Arabia, in Venezuela, in Russia, in Siberia. All of this oil had been discovered around the world. So slowly but surely, all of these other nations had their own source of energy. And then it came down to whether or not they could build refineries for that oil. Well, it's the same idea with nuclear power. So if you can control nuclear power, then you can control the world. Because if you say to a nation, you're not allowed to have your own uranium enrichment, and we're only one of few nations that have uranium enrichment capabilities, even if you have found uranium in your soil, like in Venezuela, if you don't have the capabilities of enriching it, then you're dependent on nations who can. That's another way of controlling the world as more and more nations have discovered their own oil reserves. So Iran has, they can enrich their own uranium, but then with the nuclear deal, these nations says, no, you can't. And then these developing nations like Iran say, yeah, but we want nuclear power. And these superpower nations say, well, then you need to get your uranium from us. You need to get your enrichment from us. That's the way this is going to work. And then we'll just give you the amount you need. But you can see the problem there, right? Because that just means that nation now has more control over you. And that is the problem. And that is what Iran is fighting against. It, for one, makes a nation dependent on other nations, which nations don't like to be. It, too, allows those nations who they're dependent on to bully them and to use those resources for political agendas, which we've seen time and time again. And it also is deeply demoralizing to the people of the nation. They just don't feel like a sovereign nation. If they can't operate on their own, and if they have to be 100% dependent on other nations in order to maintain their autonomy, they don't feel like it's totally demoralizing for the people. So the Iranian people have, for a long time, and many of the allies, there's been many nations around the world who've defended Iran on this over the decades, who've said, look, they should have their own abilities to have their own nuclear power plants. They're a growing, developing nation. As they're moving into this era with greater electricity needs, greater energy needs. Now everybody's got a computer and everybody has internet, and obviously the more developed a nation becomes, the more energy a nation needs. And of course, as your population increases, the more energy you need. So it gets to a point where you need a lot more energy. And right now, Iran has a nuclear power plant that pretty much would give them about 2% of 2 to 5% of their overall energy needs. It's not very much. Whereas compared to the United States, our nuclear power plants give us about 20 to 25% of our energy needs. Iran, they're using pretty dirty oil in order to make energy. It makes the nation very dirty. Tehran has a massive pollution problem. They're looking for cleaning up the environment. They're looking for more energy to support their population growth. And they're looking for more energy to support them moving into this century and being a power. They want to move on with technology and all kinds of other things. So there is a big reason why Iran would want to gain why they'd want to enrich more uranium and why they'd want to start operating and building up some of their defunct nuclear power plants. So that is really kind of what is going on here. Now, ultimately what this boils down to is the United States is doing Israel's bidding on this one. I think it's pretty obvious why the United States backed out of the Iran deal is simply because Trump is very much in bed with Israel, loves Israel. They've got a real bromance going, him and Netanyahu. And Israel has been wanting for a very long time for a much stricter, harsher policy on Iran. They really want to strip Iran of any power in the region. And, Obama wasn't really as willing to do that for Israel, but Trump is. So really, this is Israel's war, and we're going in and we're going to fight it, apparently, because what we know is going to happen potentially is Iran is going to increase their enrichment of uranium. The Israelis are going to say, oh, this is threatening. Look what they're doing. They're threatening us with a bomb. The Iranians are saying, no, we're not. Their point is, look, we don't believe in this. It's against our religion. And we've got proof of that because back in the war with Iraq, when the United States was supporting the Iraqis during the war in the 80s against Iran, the Iraqis, with U.S. support, used chemical weapons on the Iranians, and the Iranians never used chemical weapons in return because they say, look, weapons of mass destruction are against our religion. It's against what we believe, and they are a very religious government. So they're saying, look, we don't even want these weapons. They're saying, what good would it do if we had weapons? We're wanting this for energy. We don't need weapons because we're always going to be outweaponed. They're saying, look, Israel's got nukes, even though Israel won't admit to it. No one in the world knows for sure if I'm sure the United States knows, but we're pretty confident Israel has nukes. It hasn't ever been confirmed, but we're pretty sure. But it doesn't matter if Israel has one or none. The United States is right behind Israel with anything and everything. The United States has lots of nukes. Russia has lots of nukes. India, Pakistan, they have nukes. So Iran's point is, so what if we got a nuke or two? What good would it do us? We're going to be out nuked. So they say there's no point in even having them because it doesn't help you in diplomacy or in battle anyway. And they have a point because what would we do realistically? I don't think, at least I'd like to believe that the American people would not stand for the United States just nuking Iran to oblivion. I mean, if Iran has no nukes and they haven't nuked us first, we are the only nation ever to have ever dropped a couple of nukes. We did that on Japan, and we're the only nation to have ever done it. But, I think that is something that we regret deeply. We definitely don't want to see another instance of this. And so I think we would have to be nuked first before we would ever go and try to drop nukes on anybody else. Iran says we don't even have nukes. We don't care to. So if they're not going to drop nukes on us, then I think they pretty confidently are calculating that they're probably not going to have nukes dropped on them. So they're thinking, what's the point of even having one if you're never going to use it? Which, thank God, right? So I don't think that's a bad calculation, actually, on their part. I don't think the American people would stand by and watch Iran have us drop multiple nukes on Iran or even one nuke on Iran without that being, without the American people being horrified by it. I just don't think it would stand well, and I think our politicians know that, actually. So that is the Iranian take on this. This is really just, it looks like from the outside, from a more rational perspective, it looks like an energy, a race for energy, and also a potential means for trying to bring everybody back to the table. Iran obviously doesn't want to strike a better deal for the United States. Iran would rather be in the same deal they were in, if not one that's better for them. They certainly don't want to do one that's worse for them. What their current deal was, well, the deal they had, was it allowed them to keep a low-grade nuclear power plant open and enough uranium to power just that low-grade plant. But again, they have growing population, and as the world has evolved, they have growing energy needs. So they're wanting more. They've been wanting more, and I think that this deal for them is, they're looking after themselves, and I don't really blame them. I'm not making excuses for Iran. They very, who knows what'll happen. And that is really kind of the update there. So we'll see what the next round is with Iran, but that is your update. Hopefully that wasn't too jumbled. That was, again, like I said, this was my 5th time taping this video. So it is what it is now, guys, because I'm tired. So thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, hit the bell if you like what you see. Also, please support me on Patreon and PayPal. I do appreciate your support because I often do get demonetized. I never know when it's going to happen. It's been really hit or miss. Some things they demonetize and it's insane. And some things I'm kind of like, okay, I kind of understand why, I guess. Although none of these should be, quite frankly. But I do appreciate your support. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.